I would like to introduce our second fireside chat for today. Introducing Edward Snowden, Dewdney, and Mindaugas Savickas. Everybody, please give them a warm welcome.
One, two, 1, 2. Okay. Still to sit here. Hey, guys.
How are you?
Hello again.
I wanted to start actually from a random thing. You know, we were just given the swag thing. And, you know, it reminded me of that dystopian movie. I don't know who's old enough to remember the 88 movie They Live, yes. where the guy puts the glasses, you know, and he sees the world it is.
Right.
And I remember... Exactly.
Great movie.
And, you know, it just... I was thinking about two things, you know. It reminded me of that movie. That's the one thing. And then I remembered Zuck going through one of his conferences when VR was introduced, you know, and everybody was like with the glasses. Yes. And I'll get back to that, where the whole meme comes from. But today I want to kind of introduce two guests. Dylan should have been here today, but unfortunately he couldn't. So both of the guests are dialing in. I'll start with Dylan. Dylan is the founder and lead initiator at NFT3. He also co-founded Kylie Network, where he's now serving as a strategic lead. Before starting a lifelong interest in cryptography, blockchain, and decentralized systems, Dylan was director at the national security firm. Now, Dylan is 100% focused on building the first unified virtual identity in Web3. And yeah, welcome, Dylan, to the show. Excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I wanted to mention, thank you. And I wanted to mention Slavoj Zizek has an amazing analysis of the fight scene in They Live. And he breaks down this fight scene in social philosophical terms. And it's just amazing. So you should check it out.
You mean the fist fight in the alley scene?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes. Legendary.
So when I'm going to introduce Ed, I think Ed, back in 2013, made us put the glass on, actually, and see what the world is like that. He literally changed my life as well, because before that I was like chill guy. I was like nobody's gonna look for me or anything. And after that I deleted a bunch of apps. I installed Signal. Yeah, the life has changed, but like to give the man the respect that he needs. You know, in 2013, Ed single-handedly changed how we all view privacy. I guess most of the people understand what happened back then. The most important thing, Ed gave up his freedom to make the world more honest and transparent place by exposing how, you know, a multitude of Web2 services shared their user data. That's the core thing. And all the way since then, I guess we all know the story. You know, we've seen how, you know, the technology has changed, how blockchain technology advanced tremendously, and we are super excited to have Edward here today to speak with us and tell, you know, how DeData and privacy and transparency can improve the world. So, Edward, welcome, and greetings from Berlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I really appreciate the kind things you said about me. Thank you. Just one quick comment before we move on, because I know, like, anybody who has anything, let's just jump in and make this organic. But you mentioned, you know, the sort of core animating revelation of 2013 was, you know, the famous slide showing the PRISM program, where the NSA was working with the FBI to kind of coerce all the American providers to open up their data silos and just let the government rummage through it and take what they want. But it's important to remember that that was actually only a part of it. It was a very important part because it showed this close collaboration, this close relationship. And I think especially the danger of over-centralizing where our data resides. Because think about it as creating like a piggy bank or pinata with everybody's private histories of their lives in it. Any government, not just the United States government, when they see this, it becomes so attractive to them that they can't help but grab the piggy bank and break it and take all the nice things inside of it. But even absent that, it's important to remember that the government also had unilateral operations. And actually, these were also international, both with the Five Eyes surveillance network, the Anglophone countries, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Great Britain. But also many other European partners and Asian partners that they worked to different levels of familiarity, where they would basically combine their individual spying efforts on the network itself, not any specific provider, but of course the lines and the radio links and the cellular networks that are stitching all of our communications together, that are bringing this talk to you, anybody who's watching this that's not in the room physically. And of course, what's connecting my location to your location right now. All of these traffic flows, all of these network flows, then were being captured to the best of the government's abilities. And something that I think is really important to bear in mind now, and particularly as we think about ways to re-architect the network, is all of those terrifying things are 10 years old. What does the technology today look like?
Yeah, time flies fast, and it's super, like, I just want to dive right into that, like 10 years later, what has changed, Like we all talk, okay, blockchain, everything is awesome on the one hand. There are so many amazing companies I've seen here today, but like, where are we today? Like, like the way you started, it's kind of frightening in a way that it was like the older technology, back in 2013, and now like 10 years later. Is it getting better or worse right now?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to like mark the passage of time, and particularly in like crypto age, I don't remember precisely, but I think back in 2013, Bitcoin was like $300 a Bitcoin back then. That's how far we've moved. And when you look at what's changed, you think about the centralization. The most important advance that we've made is that network problem that I described. The bulk of communications back then on the internet were unencrypted. It didn't really matter, especially which browser you were using. Didn't really matter, especially what service you were using, although there were definitely ones that did far better. There were, people who did much better. There were a lot of academics in technology who were doing great work, who knew the problems. People like the Tor project that were all trying to address these things, literally years in the future, ahead of the curve. But now everyone understands unencrypted communications are toxic. They're poison. They're dangerous. However, even as we encrypt communications, there are all kinds of weaknesses in the protocol. When you look at things like DNS, it's trivial to filter it and block it because all of the people who build these networks want to be able to filter and censor the middleware creators on things like, which DNS name are you trying to fetch? And there's just flaws in the protocols, but that's just one manifestation of the dynamic, which is the government as an adversary is not going away. And it's not just, your government. It's just the United States government. It's all governments. They all understand the power that is on offer here. They are all pursuing it to varying means. And while companies have definitely addressed the low-hanging fruit, they're not especially interested, largely, particularly in sort of the legacy, if you want to call it Web 2 or whatever network, incentivized to protect your privacy. Most of them make their money by violating your privacy. They simply want to be the only ones that can violate your privacy, which is, Google's business model. They want to say, we'll protect your data to an incredible standard against our competitors. But everything that was, just between me, myself, and I, for you in your diary, in your journal, right? Your entire life's history, your entire record of movements and interactions and economic activity is sitting in your Gmail account, which we control, we read, we filter through, we see all of these things. We see what you click on, we see what websites you go to, we see what you've ordered, and based on that, categorize you into buckets and pass it off to advertisers. And if our government or any other government is interested in you, we're going to open it. We're just going to say, hey, stamp a paper and we'll give it to you. And that's sort of one dimension. Now, we have seen governments go away from that whole network-based flow approach being the most effective for content. Now, it's got very little effectiveness for content beyond simply seeing where your communications are going toward. This is, of course, metadata rather than the content. Think of it as, for those not familiar with metadata, activity records, where you are moving, who you're interacting with, what sites and servers you are interacting with. They might not see the article on a site you read because it's locked by HTTPS, but they see which server certificate or name lookup or whatever happened, and they see which IP address you associated with. And so they know the site largely that you're visiting, or they can inference it very easily. But they have realized they want corporations to have all of this content, and they want them to be able to provide it to governments. This, of course, is what happened with Apple and the giant controversy, I believe it was last year, maybe it was the very beginning of this year, where they wanted to start doing on-device scanning. And make your iPhone sort of go through your photo roll and find bad images. And if it found bad images, it would basically report you to Apple, who would report you to the cops through NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They were just opening a door wide to make your device work for someone else rather than work for you. But that wasn't actually Apple's intention, right? Apple's intention there, at least in the generous interpretation, was to go, hey, we don't want to be involved in all this content moderation. We don't want to be searching our servers and reporting our users on an individual level. We definitely don't want to put people on this job because people cost money, and we're a tech corporation. The last thing we want to do is pay other people instead of shareholders. We don't want workers. We want investors. So they were saying, if we do this and we do it successfully, you'll be able to put your things on our servers, on our iCloud. We won't know anything about them. Right now, for a large category of information, Apple can still ransack your iCloud account and turn it over to the police, and it happens all the time, right? But they were going, if we do this, then we'll enable end-to-end encryption. Only you will have the keys, only your device will have the keys, but we'll still be able to sort of make the governments happy by going, well, your devices will narc on you if there's something exceptionally terrible there. The problem is, of course, once they open that door, the list of the bad things your device will complain about will get worse and worse over time. And, then we've got telescreens in 1984, which, of course, we already have. We bought and paid for, and they're in your pocket. But the idea here was Apple knows how to protect everything on your iCloud account right now. They could do it today. They could flip the switch, and they haven't. And they probably won't until they feel like they can get the government off their back by going, oh, well, we'll let you into people's lives through a different way. Now, I actually appreciate that Apple is thinking about ways to try to improve people's privacy, although it's very self-interested here and it's not a great solution. But the idea that they were recognizing end-to-end encryption is important and we need to do this is great. A lot of other big companies aren't doing that. And this is the distinction between Apple and them. They don't want to turn on end-to-end encryption, like Google doesn't want to turn on end-to-end encryption, like Facebook doesn't want to turn on end-to-end encryption except for direct messages, because they profit from that information. They want to have it readable. They want to have it available to them so that they can parse through it. And they can understand all their customers and then exploit them on that basis. And I think this is when we think about what's changed, going back to just the core of the question. Yeah. We've started protecting the network, and we've done it largely successfully. There's still weak spots. It's still going to take us 10 years to basically shake those middleware parasites off the protocols and start to do things in a more protective layer, or start to put layers on top of layers so there's less useful information there. And it's probably going to take another big motivating scandal, unfortunately, or a giant hack or something like that to cross that next hurdle. But on this silo side, we still have this problem where the interests of the corporations are not aligned with the interests of their customers. Apple cares less about keeping their customers happy than it does about keeping the government happy. Otherwise, they already would have turned end-to-end encryption on. Google doesn't care at all about keeping their users happy because their users are not their customers. The advertisers are. And this is one of the things that I think is powerful about this sort of idea of decentralized data, bringing us back to the forum here, and more broadly about just the decentralization effort of the next architecture of the internet. If we can achieve it, and in a useful way, as opposed to just sort of the venture capital profiteering way, is this is what allows us to align services and users' sort of interests together. When we have people who own their own data in kind of like a Tim Berners-Lee like solid type model, where you have your data share, you have your data identity, you have all of these things in blocks that you control that can then be linked out to all these services and providers when you need them, when you want to interact with them, but they don't retain them, they can't sort of transform them, they can't control them. That will really change the game if we can get there. But of course, there's a lot of questions about plausibility. Will this work? How will this work? The bottom line is any progress here is important because the current architectural model of the internet is fundamentally flawed. It is hostile to the individual, and it is very advantageous and beneficial to the institution. If we can start to change that, even if it does mean when you open these silos, your own personal silo, because you need to interact with some service, they take a snapshot of it, even if they're not supposed to. They steal it and then they rummage through it, whatever, keep a copy of it forever. They're still only getting those snapshot slices, right? You're giving them a piece at a time, and then if you choose not to give them anything else in the future, they've only got that, as opposed to the current model, where if you think about, whether it's Apple or Google, whoever makes the smartphone in your pocket knows everything about your life. They literally know your phone number. They know your phone's hardware identifiers. They know your email addresses. They know whether you've updated or not. They know where your phone is moving on the network. They know your time zone. They know the languages you've got installed. They can uniquely identify your device anywhere in the world, where it is on the network, who it's interacting with, who the peers are, right? And a lot of the apps on your phone can do the same thing because their operating systems are made in a way that is less advantageous, less beneficial, again, to the person who paid for it, the person who owns the device, as it is to the sort of actors that are supposed to be transiently present on your device, sort of the app makers and websites that you pass through. And I think this is just basically where we get back on track and zoom out of this a little bit. Right now, the architecture of the internet is broken. Everybody sees it, and we all feel it. But how do we move beyond that?
Dylan, I wanted to turn quickly to you. The Web3, is it the answer to the broken model that Edward just mentioned, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think sort of like by way of analogy, I think you had asked earlier, where are we at? And I think where we're at is sort of like global warming in the 80s. So not to date myself, but when I was growing up, global warming was actually a political issue. And it actually was getting some currency among people. And I remember I was actually in a play where it was like a Planet, Captain Planet play or something when I was a kid. And I look back on that and I think, we had that narrative. We knew what was going wrong back in the 80s, but it wasn't until, almost 40 years later that we're actually starting to get real political headway with with changing our habits around consumption and the climate and climate change and global warming, et cetera. It's still global warming. We just call it climate change because it sounds nicer. So I think we're at that point now with the transition between, or should I say the evolution of Web 2 to Web 3. It's like the 80s and it's like global warming, except it's 2022 and I call it, data warming. The issues surrounding the data models, I guess, or the dynamics of data within Web 2, like Ed says, are very clear. And it's only going to heat up and intensify. And we will get to a point, if another 20 years passes, that we don't start taking action, and if we don't start spearheading and pioneering among ourselves and in our groups and working hard to find models that get adopted that have a basis in decentralized data or DData or Web3 or whatever you want to call it, then we're going to be in a really tough place because we'll be essentially co-opted, Web3 models or CBDCs or whatever it is that is this perversion of what is the intention. And I think that that's something we all have to be really actually, quite serious about. I'm glad we've gathered a lot of, great minds today. And I am part of that gathering of, everybody who's here are like some of the brightest minds building in this area. Like we're literally architecting this stuff as we speak. And if we're not, pretty serious about it, I think it's not good. And we need to be very serious about what's at play here.
Edward, I want to come back to you. So we talked a lot about Web 2 companies. You mentioned Apple, Google. Now I want to switch gears a bit to Web 3 and to hear your professional opinion about the whole DData. How do you look, how it's kind of different from, those examples, those broken examples that you just mentioned, in Web 2 world? And is it really just a hype, and most of the companies are trying to use the buzzwords and just to hype up. You mentioned the VC thing, we've seen what very knowledgeable names have said and about the Web3 just to raise more money and just do bullshit basically. So when it comes to Web3 and the real DData, like what do you envision? What's the real DData models that we should follow? What's the right way would be like the ideal way to go forward?
Yeah, so when I think of this, I think most people have a reflexive understanding from any sort of new business movement, shall we say. It's a gold rush. And there is a lot of hype. And unfortunately, most of what you see in the Web3 space is hype. It is a money grab. It is a sort of a VC sort of land grab. Or it's like a complete scam where you see people, entering some kind of token or setting up some DAO, and they go, "Oh, we're going to give you this governance token or whatever. We're going to do votes and everything like that," and they do a great job creating a narrative that gives people a lot of hope, and then they exploit these people. They take their money, they pull the rug out from under them. And then you're left with the equivalent of Chuck E. Cheese tokens. I don't even know if you guys know what Chuck E. Cheese tokens are. This is like Dylan, another sort of example of dating myself, but it's like changing real money into a useless token that sort of doesn't exist outside the space within which it was created. In this case, a DAO. Well, if the DAO's not doing anything, if the treasury's been raided, it does governance token doesn't mean anything. I mean, we've seen that happen again and again and again. Is that the same as sort of Web3 businesses broadly? No, it's not. And there are some that are doing a great job, or at least doing an honest job, trying to make something new. There's a lot of things that have happened in like the NFT space, that it's a different culture, right? These people may have different values. They may appreciate things differently than sort of the average consumer in a major first world country today because they're focused entirely on virtual property, right? But the distinction between what's virtual and what's real is beginning to erode over time. And so it's hard to sort of cast it out and go, this is a waste of time. It's whatever. I actually think we've seen, for example, philanthropy and fundraising. NFTs are one of the biggest game changers, particularly for anything that's digital technology related, that's ever happened in the space. I mean, I'm the president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and we raised like $5 million off a single NFT auction. And I think that's a tremendous thing and very useful to people who are just what I would call the do-gooders of the internet, who don't have a business model but are trying to fund good deeds. And this is a way for a community that has a lot of economic clout and sort of stake to give back. And that's actually become kind of a virtuous cycle. But beyond that, like what's actually happening in the functional space, well, we see a lot of interest in sort of the virtual reality space. And this is interesting and promising. Somebody has to do it better, of course, than Zuckerberg, because he's the one who's made a tremendous bet of his entire company to get there first and to do it best in terms of developing sort of the infrastructure and real estate, that even if right now it looks terrible and bland and boring, they have the money to sort of A and B test it until they get what enough people or the majority of people want or like. They'll onboard a ton of people, and then there'll be captives in this new walled garden that he controls. And he's very open, I think, that this is his strategy. Now, a lot of people go, oh, well, it's a passing fad, it's VR. But when we go back to that same idea of, well, where are people spending most of their time? For a lot of people today in sort of our late stage capitalism era, you're either at work or you're at home looking at a screen. It could be a screen in your hand, on the bus. It could be a screen sitting on the wall, across from your couch. You could be laying in bed at night and you're looking at a screen instead of talking to your spouse or significant other. You're both next to each other and looking at your screens. And there's something terrible and tragic in that, but at the same time, we have to recognize that is a choice that people are making in many cases, not all cases freely, to escape from the reality and existence in which they have found themselves, right? And so the idea that people are constructing virtual realities that maybe may attract more attractive, more interesting, and there's virtual properties that are more interesting and affordable than what they can get in the real world. Like it can be sad in many cases, but it's also very real. It reminds me of back, when I was online. People used to ask, what do you do IRL? Who are you IRL? Like in real life. When's the last time you heard anybody use IRL? Your digital life is your real life. And for many people, it's where they spend the majority of their time. So you've got these honest infrastructure initiatives, whether they're academically driven, whether they are industry driven, the type of Tim Berners Solid project. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You see things like the Filecoin Foundation, right? Where it is an altcoin, but it's actually a real coin with a real model, and they do real things. And it's very different than the ones that are sort of the scammy land grabs. At the same time, you see people moving into like identity. You see things moving into currency that are more, shall we say, CBDC friendly or focused. Like they are trying to intrude into the digital world with the old centralized world. They are trying to centralize the decentralized. So when you ask me like what works in the DeData model, for a lot of people, it's I'm not speaking strictly about like NFTs and things like that. Sure, it's there, it's great, it's the new sort of exciting thing. All the people who tried to use it as investment have seen nothing but red for like however long the bear market's been. But when we actually just think about the decentralization of data, I still think Bitcoin is the best example. The data is a global economic ledger. It works. It's been attacked a zillion times. Everybody who is in the digital space, who is interested in sort of the next stage of the digital space, has used it or has touched it. Ethereum, of course, is taken it to a whole nother sort of level, and there's an entire ecosystem there. And all of this is profoundly impressive, but we have to learn from the failures of these too. They work, they have value, they will continue to be here. They are sort of the building blocks upon which all these other sort of projects and ecosystems try to build. But they have a privacy problem. I heard somebody in the last session bring up, tornado and the U.S. government trying to go, oh, sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. Like it's the first thing they say. Anytime there's something they don't like in the world today, the U.S. government's just like sanctions, sanctions. Like you wonder where these things come from. There's no law being passed. It's just pure executive authority. They go, naughty, naughty. You're sort of stricken from the world's economic system. And the idea that just one government can do that for everyone, everywhere, including Americans. And you have no court process. You have nothing that you can go through. They're trying to be sued by Coinbase now. But there are some very smart lawyers who go, even if Coinbase's arguments are entirely correct, even if their legal theories are true and persuasive, the government is far beyond its constitutional authorities. It's far beyond its legal authorities. The court is more likely than not to side with the government, regardless of what is right, because they just don't want to say the government can't regulate this space in this particular way. And that's not actually even what they're saying. That's not what the alternative would be if Tornado Cash wasn't sanctioned. It would just be using different mechanisms. It would be going after the individual actors. It would be going after the individual states, as we always have throughout history. But states, as technology changes, are getting lazier. And they are reaching for the most effective, most reliable, and quickest means of influencing how things head. And then you have a lot of sort of these groups in this space. For example, decentralized exchanges, something like DYDX, that immediately roll over and show, not only are we going to block anybody who's ever had anything that even smelled like this, like 10 degrees out, and then, they try to change it and sort of roll it back and do a little bit better. Great. It's positive. They should be lauded for that. But they err too far on the side of compliance. They haven't gotten a directive. The police haven't knocked on their door. There's been no visit or direct influence from the government. And then they start going further with this. I think there was recently something where they said they're going to do biometric scans of your faces in order to get some airdrop token or whatever. And this is supposed to be a Web3 sort of DData property, right? And that should alarm us. If you are trying to take the old broken model and import it and bake it in to your new model without anybody knocking on your door, even, there is something fundamentally wrong with the principles and ideals of the way that business is operating. Because the idea here is we are trying to do better than what already exists. Otherwise, why do you exist, right? And a lot of people go, we'll deal with that some other time. But the bottom line here is Bitcoin has a privacy problem. We all know it. It's a global ledger. It's open. It's all tied to everyone's identity because they're using KYC exchanges where, you have to go in and drop your pants in order for them to go, okay, you are who you say you are. And basically try to make everyone naked there. Then the Ethereum network is actually worse for privacy than the Bitcoin network because it's an account-based model where instead of using a different address for every transaction, people are going back and forth between the same addresses. And it shows all of your interactions with all of these different sort of sidechain activities and, ERC20 tokens and whatnot, all in one convenient place. And Tornado was actually a way to improve on this. People are like, oh, you're helping, money launderers or whatever. You're mixing tokens with them. That's not actually technically true with the way it worked. You're all moving your coins to the same place, but the coins that you put in are the coins that you're getting out. They've just been blinded. Sorry, I know this has probably gotten too down in the weeds and off sort of where it's supposed to be, but the idea is what works and what doesn't. has to be our constant focus. The problem with the old world, the problem with the real world, is that there is too much power and influence centralized in too few hands. These hands are unaccountable to the public. They are unaccountable to the law. They routinely abuse their powers openly, flagrantly. It's in the headlines of the newspapers, and they suffer no consequences for that, right? We see a lot of DData companies that are not truly decentralized, or rather sort of Web3 companies. They put on a show of being decentralized. Moxie Marlinspike showed a big flaw, of course, with the way the Ethereum network works, which is we're like everybody out there is using a small handset of wallets or a small subset of wallets. And all the wallets are going through two API providers, and those guys can do whatever they want. And as soon as you get these guys who are over-centralized, and they have addresses, right? They have IDs. They're all KYC'd everywhere. Someone is going to knock on their door. And that's where the problems start, right? We need to start thinking about we have just come out of an authoritarian, I want to say century, but it's authoritarian history. The last 20 years of this century have been showing an increase of authoritarianism. And authoritarianism thrives because of centralized powers, institutions that have grown to have too much influence, but they are fragile. They are weak. They can be sort of taken over and then redirected. If we import those practices into the new architecture, we will replicate the same flaws that came out of Web 2, right? Web 2 started with high ideals, but where it starts and where it ends is a very different thing.
Dialing up.
I'm curious.
Thanks, Edward, for going deep. Actually, I really appreciate that. Dylan, I really wanted to dial in back to self-sovereign identity and surveillance. What are your thoughts on data use cases like self-sovereign identity and how it will affect the surveillance today, from your perspective?
Yeah. I'm actually I'm happy to speak about that for sure. But I wanted to I wanted to follow up with what Ed was saying about. So I guess I kind of wonder this. It's like once we take the financial rails away from the state, I think that the only thing left is the monopolization on the use of violence. And so if the monopolization of the use of violence is sort of like the last thing that a state has, I think that that's what they'll use. I think that that's why a lot of teams will just automatically err on the side of caution, because they'll say, "Oh, I don't want to go to jail," and I think that there's something. I think there's something really wrong with that. I wanted to know, is that your view as well, that essentially states have this monopolization on the use of violence, and therefore that's sort of the final trump card to the authority that they have, or the people within?
Well, certainly. I mean, when we're talking about just where does a state derive its power from, it's all violence. It's tax and violence, and tax comes from violence. But I think that sort of misses the importance of it. What is a state but simply an institution, right? It's a entity that arises from the joint efforts of many, many people. It is supposed to be representative of the efforts and interests of the people of an entire nation. But in basically every case we have of any long-term history, it begins to divorce its activities and actions from representing the nation and the people broadly to subsets of the nation and the people, those who have sort of influence over the electoral process, those who have sort of lobbying power and influence, whether that's corporately or whatever. Basically, you have the kind of classic rent seeking that we see everywhere. And this is what we have in the world today. Everybody, look, dial back away from anything related to Web3, crypto, blockchain, anything like that right now. Look at the world today. Look at the actions of governments. You see more controversy. You see more sort of inside dealing. You see more corrupt practice. I don't care if you're in the United States. I don't care if you're in Germany. And I don't care if you're in Russia. I don't care if you're in China. It is a global trend where we see governments doing more. They have greater capability because of technology acting as a magnifier of pre-existing power. It allows them to increase their leverage, right? And they're leveraging their influence to try to sort of act and compete, not just within their own borders, but globally. And now we have those levers starting to press on each other, and it's causing sort of problems and conflicts all over the world. However, what are governments? What is your government doing that's really good, that's extraordinary, that makes you believe in it, that makes you think, the next century will be better than the last century? A lot of people have a sense that society in the world, globally, is in decline. We're beginning to sort of push up against resource limits. You see groups like the World Economic Forum that are trying to drastically reduce the production of meat. They're starting to tell people to, eat crickets and things like that. We see, of course, energy shortages and everything everywhere. All of these things, compare them to 100 years ago when the projects of government were the construction of social security systems. They were the enfranchisement of entire new classes of the population, allowing them to vote. It was sending people to the moon, right? It was rural electrification. It was the construction of highway systems. Where do you see that today? Right? What is the modern equivalent? And this is where we get back to your violence and government. Any institution that derives its legitimacy from violence alone is not legitimate. The problem is people are not seeing examples of governments doing good deeds or good enough deeds to persuade them that the government is truly worthy, not just of sort of our taxes, but of our allegiance, of our identification with them, to recognize that the government is not sort of a they or a them, but the government is a we, that we are a part of it, that we should strive to serve it, that if we're doing so, we're not acting against ourselves or our neighbors in the long term or just one election alone, but this is something that will sort of empower all of us together. And this is what I think we need to remember. The reason that governments are failing the persuasion test is they are not focused on sort of helping us, the people, their people, or more broadly, the people of the world collectively. They are protecting their institution. They are furthering the interests of their institution. We have a corporate business climate around the world where people go to work for entities, corporations that have the same mindset. And we have all convinced ourselves, or been convinced, or if we haven't been convinced, we've been threatened into compliance with the idea that that's the fiduciary interest or fiduciary duty of these institutions, is to serve their stakeholders, right, the investors or whatever, rather than to serve humanity. But if we don't serve humanity and we serve only ourselves to the exclusion of everything else, of course, the monopoly on violence becomes more important, because how else are you going to how else are you going to be able to permit yourself to continue carrying out antisocial activities? And it's, I think, astonishing to people, the idea, the conception that a government, which is supposed to be like a pro-social organization, could be engaged in antisocial activities, particularly democracy, right? But that's a longer story and a longer conversation. When we bring this back in to sort of the network state as it is, or the state of the network, and we talk about people building and people who are afraid of that application of violence, People who are trying to change the world, people who have an idea that they think really will unsettle their government or the American government, right? Or anyone with a sort of large reach like that, at least domestically, need to change their lives to prepare for that opposition. Maybe you can stay and do it domestically. Maybe you can do clever lawyering, whatever. But for a lot of people, I think we need to consider, particularly when we talk about that resource scarcity, the fact that more people are spending time, within their sad little apartment. Unfortunately, nowadays, half the time isn't going to be heated. And you're living in a virtual world. We need to recognize that there is a post-national identity or post-national identities that are being formed. And when you talk about sort of this question that you were asking Dylan about self-sovereign identities and all that, I think the thing that we need to guard against, the thing that we need to be prepared for, the thing that we already see being done are, the super states are trying to layer on top of this, where they go, all right, maybe Google and Facebook aren't going to be the sole identity providers for the world. Wonderful progress there. However, we're going to issue identities. You got to come to our office. You got to, take your pants off again. And then we will say, we certify you, and then everybody will go on this new chain and use that. We are simply re-centralizing with a different central authority. We need to recognize that identity doesn't come from authority. Identity doesn't come from a centralized service, verifying documents. It comes from trust. And trust can arise from a very different thing, which is a history of interactions. And if you simply have a token, it's generated in your wallet or whatever, somebody mentioned MetaMask before, it's an Ethereum address, it's a Bitcoin address, it's XYZ token address. And you simply go, this person has no history whatsoever. They're trying to interact with the store for a low value interaction. The risk is low, a fraud or something like that. It's prepayment in advance on chain. Maybe they can't do anything that's like credit based or whatever. But look, they did this, they engaged in this transaction, and it wasn't fraudulent. Well, that trust score goes up a little bit based purely on history. You don't know who they are, you don't know where they are, you don't know what they're doing it for. When you get 100 of those, when you get 1,000 of those, when you get 10 years of those, you may have no idea who this person is. No one has ever checked a document, but they know they try to avail themselves of a service. They use it honestly, and no one has ever sort of filed any derogative appendices to that identifier. We need to recognize that human identity, physical identity, corporal identity is a discriminator. It enables prejudice, it enables discrimination, and it enables the application of violence. If we are moving towards, unfortunately, a more virtualized existence, we should be moving toward more virtual identities.
I am so inspired and encouraged to hear your perspective on that, Edward. I couldn't agree more. I believe the basis of us moving into the future adequately and fairly is definitely has a basis in some new technologies and decentralized, in particular, I think, decentralized identifiers in concert with verifiable credentials. And we can definitely, I think we have all of the tools, I guess, in our tool set to have that kind of a future. And I liken the advent of decentralized identifiers to the advent of HTTP back in the standardization of HTTP back in '99 when it was finally standardized. We just reached the standardization from the World Wide Web Consortium for Decentralized Identifiers, and it's, to me, I think it's an incredible opportunity that we have through my work with NFT3, but also other people who are here at the salon, Disco with Evan, Civic, many others working on this idea of trying to encapsulate the authority and agency of individuals within themselves and and envisioning that the internet in a Web3 or DData form is actually going to be certainly fairer, more equitable. But I actually think there's some efficiencies and some really interesting ways that we could maybe have a more exciting vision of what particular business models could exist on the internet, and beyond just advertising or selling metadata, which is literally it's like, what is it? It's like metadata, advertising, and e-commerce. Those are like the two things on the internet that are making money. That's like it. And I think that if the locus of authority and agency starts to be the repository, the data backpack, if you will, to borrow a term from Evan, is within the individual, then we can start to envision a lot of new, I think, business models and efficiencies that had this sort of like P2P orientation that we've never really seen before. And I really do feel that that DData is the substance of Web3 as a concept and as a notion, rather than just sort of like Web3, just being like this nebulous kind of concept. It could be, metaverse or NFT. Like, we really need to focus on data sovereignty as the sort of crux of all of this. And my supposition is that once the first stories start coming out in a handful of years about people, having some sort of personal capitalization as a result of their data sovereignty or new models or efficiencies, then I think that my hope is that it's going to evolve quickly, because now all of a sudden it's quite valuable and useful for a number of people.
Gentlemen, it's been, the time flies. Everybody is like, you could hear a mice, like everybody is like listening.
Right, you can hear a pin drop right
yeah, you can hear a pin drop while you guys are talking. But I really wanted to give an applause and a Q&A session. Who's got the question? We have a...
So I heard a lot of topics touched upon, like pseudonymity, data sovereignty, like owning your software tools instead of being owned by them, and so on. Network state of self-sovereign P2P individuals, and like one up-and-coming project that springs to mind like immediately is Urbit. I don't know if that rings any bells. And for anyone for whom it doesn't ring a bell, it's sort of the interesting thing about it is that it's a very wholesale approach to all these things. It's like you own your own little server and everything is P2P messaging, basically, with your own wallets and everything. So it's sort of, instead of trying to replace the little pieces of the internet that are broken one by one, it's sort of, let's clean slate and do this all over again. And I'm just curious what you think of those two different approaches, like patching up the things one by one, or just like clean slating a new network state, and what are the risks and potential rewards from like taking each of those approaches? And I mean that applies to blockchain and DData as well, right? You can either plug and play with small improvements, or you can try to start from the beginning and just wipe out all the existing power and see if you can make headway fast enough to get away.
Sure, I'll let Dylan go to this after just a sort of a brief comment here. I think one of the things when I speak to young audiences in the United States of sort of well-motivated people who want to do good, they're interested in like civil liberties, activism and reform, or college groups, is they're asking, how can they fix the government? What can they do to make things better? And I think this is actually sort of analogous to what's happening in the problems with Web 2, where there's too much central authority. And how do we fix it? And a lot of these people will go, well, why don't I go work for the government? Why don't I go work for, the White House or the Justice Department or the spy agencies or whatever, and try to make them more accountable. And it's the same thing if you're going to work for Google or Facebook or Amazon or Netflix or whatever. whether we're looking about this in terms of physical infrastructure, whether we're talking about this in human infrastructure, you have to recognize that institutions that you are trying to reform are also trying to reform you. That's what the tornado cache thing is all about. It's about the government seeing that people are able to use an effective technology. It's easy to access, and honestly, it's not used by very many people because the amount of people who are sort of transacting in the Ethereum ecosystem, even though it's big for crypto, is nothing in human terms. It's nothing in global terms, right? And the people who are interacting with this contract and doing all this stuff, and onion addresses and all of that, it's fractions of percent. But they see the trend, and they see that the trend sort of will influence them. It will shift how they act. It will shift how they operate. And so they try to get ahead of it, and they try to change it. When you start operating on things, when you start to replace things bit by bit, when you start slapping patches on the system, if it's a good patch, if it can't be rolled back, if you can get that pull request adopted, you can make big changes on live systems and change the world. That's what happened post 2013. And it wasn't as a result of sort of me. I didn't write the code, but everybody out there who had any sense of justice whatsoever that saw what the headlines were in 2013 and went, these bastards just violated the rights, not just of everybody in that country, but everybody all around the world. And they did it because our communications were not encrypted, because we weren't using HTTPS, because we weren't doing this, because we weren't doing that. Or in the case of Google, right, they were tapping the cables that were connecting their data centers directly, even though they could have just gone to them with a warrant or even just a subpoena and said, hand over all of this stuff. They went, oh, that's too difficult. That's too burdensome. That's whatever. Let's not do that. Let's just get it directly to the maximum extent that we can. Well, a few people in the right place doing the right thing created a movement. They created pressure on the other ones. They created an example to emulate, and everybody else adopted the example because the example was persuasive. This is, again, going back to those failures of government that I was describing before, why they're relying more on violence and coercive authority, or they're robbing you through manipulation of sort of central bank rates and the value of your currency, because they don't want to raise the tax rate, because if they raise the tax rate, people will see it and they'll respond. But if they devalue your currency, they get the same value, but they just, you aren't asked, you don't get a vote, you don't even know that it's happening until it's too late. The same thing happens in systems approaches, right? You can set a good example. You can show a better model so long as you can come up with one, so long as you can demonstrate it. Other people will emulate that example if it works, if it's effective, right? And I think this is what it is. Whether you do it in one patch, whether you do it in a whole new system and you try not to bring in all that cruft, that could be, frankly, sort of counter-revolutionary and try to pull it back. Go, oh, what about the middleware providers? That, in my mind, are the dynamics. And this is also how we sort of fix government, if it is to be fixed, instead of sort of moving beyond government, sort of the post-national, post-government world, the world that is beyond government. Not that it's ungovernable, although it might be, but because it no longer sees the value in government as it currently is constituted. Government services, or services that are provided today by governments, could be provided elsewhere, if they can be. And if they would be, someone will eventually demonstrate it, right? The dark and scary thing is that it is being demonstrated today. A lot of places, like in the United States, you see this in a negative example through things like health insurance, or lawyering, where the rich have perfect freedom, perfect liberty, perfect care, but the average person has nothing. They have no recourse. They're subjected to the worst abuses and friction of government. The same thing is happening technologically. People who are using private services, people who are paying for VPNs, people who are, paying for better phones. They don't have all the adware injected into the loop with it. They are using private distributions and operating systems. Maybe they don't even understand how they work. They just bought a box that said pro-privacy, and they had other people do the work for them. But it all comes back to we can do better. I think everybody sees the failures that exist today, and we simply have to do it. You have to show it can be done. You have to demonstrate that it can be done, and then people will come to you. If government's only sort of persuasive force is do this or we will beat you or jail you or kill you, government needs to go away. However, if government shows we can do this better than any commercial competitor, we can do this better than any private alternative, they will convince people that, yeah, more of this, please. The fact that they're not trying is what should concern us.
Dylan, do you have anything to add, or we can go to another question?
Yeah, I'll be brief.
Yes.
I think that the way forward probably. I'm a little. I definitely have a philosophical orientation to all this, but I have some cynicism in the sense that I don't think that there's going to be good adoption until we can provide some products at the application layer that will help people realize some of the benefits of DData or Web3 orientation.
For what it's worth, I agree with that. I don't think the model alone is enough.
Sorry.
You're right. It has to actually work.
Sorry, I didn't mean to diminish your argument.
No. You're right. It's an important point. Go on.
And yeah, so I think once it's sort of like the proof is in the pudding, you know, and once people started to feel like, I guess when I was pitching some investors for NFT3, I was like, listen, you know, once people see that the hot dog sellers on the street are like, oh, like these people are getting the hot dogs. Okay, yeah, I get them. I'm getting them for free, but these people are selling them, right? And they're making money. Okay, this is the thought experiment that you have as a Web3 denizen rather than a Web2 denizen. You say, well, because I signed on with this service, I have a decentralized identifier associated. I'm only using this kind of ecosystem to live my life on the internet. Because of that, I'm getting some sort of personal capitalization or benefit through living my Web3 life in the most decentralized way possible. Because now I can get the benefit of, you know, some sort of capitalization as a result of sharing my data on my own terms, and that is, I think, a key ingredient to this evolving quickly and effectually. But I think that it's incumbent upon the people in this room to have that philosophical orientation, certainly, so we can get there, so we can get to these products that people will use and that people will benefit from. And that's my take on that. And so I think that in terms of patchwork, I think what I envision is that we'll have probably a number of configurable sort of like modular SDKs that people can incorporate, whether they're, you know, like if they're in a Web2 context or whether they want to build this or that, and they can mix and match a bunch of different features of DData or Web3 via, you know, like insert decentralized identifier, you know, creator here, or get or blah blah blah, right? Or utilize, you know, functional encryption like Ruby's working on. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Guys, 2 more questions, I guess, because we can go on and on, but like I see.
Yes. This question is for all 3 of you. It's a bit more lighthearted, but still relevant nevertheless. So if, let's say, we build society based on storytelling, you know, from early prehistoric cave paintings to modern literature and movies. And Mindaugas, you made an awesome movie reference to They Live. And what comes to mind also is Blade Runner, Johnny Mnemonic, Ghost in the Shell, Matrix, that whole cyberpunk era. In your collective opinion, what movie or movies, book series best explain and articulate what is going on right now? Because, you know, there's many things that seem to be recurring themes. You have the omnipotent superstate or supercorporation, essentially engineering and micromanaging society. And you also see the loss of humanity and people striving for humanity and sovereignty. So, with all these things that are recurring themes in different ways, in different forms, what, I guess you could say, which literary or you could say cinematic outlet or series, I guess you could say, strikes all three of you in the most poignant way of explaining what's going on today?
May I jump on that first?
Yeah.
So I've been reading to my daughter actually 1984. So when Ed, you started talking about telescreens, I was like, that's on point. What's crazy is that
right,
because what's crazy is that was written almost 100 years ago. So the prescience of it is stunning. I think it's like, really, like almost 100 years ago this was written. So Orwell is dealing with these questions, all the way back then. I do think it's a good analogy for our times, but I also think that I think it's like we also have to be kind of hopeful and optimistic too. Like a lot of people throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to Web 2. Like, we did get to know everything at all times thanks to Web 2. So that was good. But we need to know that this was a Faustian bargain, and that happening was, it really led to some of the as Ed calls it, a leveraging of that against us, and us meaning, the masses, right? So I would say 1984 is a good analogy, but I think that we need to also maintain a bit of glimmer of hope that, we're human beings, we're creative, we find ways out of things and into things, and I think there's every chance that there's sort of a Hegelian dialectic encapsulated here in Web 2, where the conditions for its evolution or state change is within it, the tensions that we feel now.
Mindaugas, you want to go next? And
I was thinking about, it's always like that when someone tells what you think. No, but I was thinking about Matrix, kind of in a way. So if we take the last movie, I don't know, I'm not in a position to say which one was the best. It's just our own sense, right? But at the end of the day, we kind of see it like play out well. It's kind of, it gives us hope, right? Kind of so. So I'm with Dylan here, where I would see we are humans. We kind of figure out things throughout the years. And I really hope what Ed mentioned, when we were trying to get to the moon. I always use this JFK. We do things not because they are easy, we're doing because they are hard, So I do hope there is this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a naive thing to think, but like, we need to somehow push ourselves to do better, and we need to push for like this good ending, and live something for the next generation. Because who, if not we, gonna build like the best examples, for.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Ed, I mean, I would. I actually have to drop very soon because I can hear my little son in the other room screaming because it's bedtime. But I'd say, although 1984, of course, is close to the mind and always instructive, there's the counterexample of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is not that it's force and violence that are used to sort of manipulate us into ignoring sort of the exploitation of the people in the world broadly, but it's that we have been taught to amuse ourselves to death. From birth until death, we are born into a kind of bondage. And this happens today with our nationality. People say, oh, if you don't like the way it is here, go somewhere else. Have you ever tried? Like, it's incredibly difficult to change, get citizenship somewhere else. Even just to change residency, particularly for somebody who's not sort of rich, it just doesn't happen. But there are systems built around us to compete for our attention, to help us escape from the reality in which we are sort of placed. And this has become so comfortable, so natural to us, that there is a kind of inertia where it's hard to leave, and it's painful to leave because confronting reality is uncomfortable, and it's difficult, and there's no guarantee of success. In fact, there's a very high likelihood of failure. We have to remind people that sort of that striving, that effort, even if we fail, is valuable. It's worthy of our time. It's worthy of our attention. And that's actually where a good part of, I think, the joy of life comes from. What we have forgotten in all of our entertainment, in all of the distractions, is for many of us purpose. And you see so many people who have everything, whether they're a rock star or whatever. Materially, their needs are met, but they're sad, they're empty, they're depressed, they're medicated. They recede into their screens. They recede into their social networks. They go into this Instagram reality where they try to make their own life look better than it is, capturing only the best parts of it, none of the bad parts of it, present it to their communities to make it so they can be popular, so they can be liked, so they can be valued, but also in a real way, I think, to try to convince themselves that things, their life, their circumstances are better than they are. And that is a coping mechanism. In the same way, I forget what the drug was called, some kind of like Somna or Soma in Huxley's Brave New World. Yeah, we are trying to forget our reality, and we are trying to amuse ourselves until our time here is up. But when you've got kids, you've got to think about what they are going to head into. And we have been in we are coming out of a century in which authoritarianism, led to a sort of world war. And we see that sort of drumbeat rising again. And I think we have to make this a post-authoritarian century. We have to reject that the kind of politics of conflict. We need to make the pendulum swing back in the anti-authoritarian direction. In fact, far beyond the balance point, far beyond what many of us would be comfortable with, right? We all want some stability. We all want to know there's someone we can go to when things are bad. But we have to move beyond the hyper-regulated world into something that is a little bit free, a little bit risky, frankly, even a little bit dangerous, in order that we can be reminded and rediscover and build upon what is necessary. What are the parts of the system that we left, of the hyper-authoritarian closed world, that we miss? We won't miss them until they're gone. But all of our freedoms, all of the things that we've lost, all of just the moment to be alone and unobserved, that has been lost to us. And I think people are beginning to miss it. I think we see a level of noise and dialogue surrounding us that reminds us the idea of democracy is that many voices get you a better quality decision. But that only works when we're all invested in it. That only works when we're all invested in the truth. That only works when we're all invested in the outcomes. And the outcome has to be more than my side wins, your side loses. We have to care about what happens to everyone the day after the vote, right? And I think when you look at any social network today, I think when you look at it, sort of any media representation of what's happening in the world today, you see a partisanship. And I don't mean just a commitment to sort of party, but to side. And that has, I think, materially harmed the world where we're at now. But like Dylan said, we need hope. And I think we are at, unfortunately, a dark point in history. We really have been since this century began with 9/11 and the sort of mistaken reactions to that that made militarization the hot new trend. But the promise of the internet, what was really lost from its early days that we remember in like the 90s, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace era, was that it was this community of the mind, right? What was lost there was that it's many communities of the mind, and the mind being like-minded in values, right? Amongst the different communities. The idea is these are communities of choice, and you don't need one rule for all people. People can go where they belong in the way that we can't do it in the physical space, the way that we are restrained. And when we start talking about, unfortunately, these virtual spaces, I say unfortunately because it would be more wonderful if we could embody them physically, bodily, but we aren't sort of granted that opportunity right now at this stage in our development. If at least virtually we can learn to present ourselves the way we are, we can be loved for who we are, and we can learn to love others for who they are that is different than how we are, which is something that we've lost in all these filter bubbles. We only love the like-minded, right? But that's where you find yourself. Then you have to find how to live with everyone else. That's the fundamental step that we're missing. Instead of being born into bondage and dying in bondage, maybe we can reach a point where we are not subject to sort of the forces of violence, but embraced in communities of choice. And I think that's where the hope comes from. Maybe we have to build them digitally right now. Maybe we have to build them virtually. But whether we live online or IRL, it's the same thing. These are the hours of our lives. What we do matters. What we say matters. How we spend them and who we spend them with matters. And what we lost in the last decades, both digitally and physically, is that sense of choice. We don't have as many choices for how we spend our time or who we spend our time with, or who our time is intermediated by with services and platforms because of all of the centralization. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I think it won't be in time.
I think that's a perfect note. The hope and building something better for the future. Ed, Dylan, thanks.
Thank you so much. Beautifully said.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay free.
Bye-bye.